This is some exploration work using the Chekhov tools, expansion and contraction. I've taken a 3-line monologue, so it's 3 lines, triplicity, but also in that short monologue range, 15 to 30 seconds. So I've taken a short monologue from Picnic, and I'll be exploring it full out expanded, full out contracted, and then full out contract to expand and expand to contract. I'll call them as I go in case I mix them up. Again, this is an exploration. It's not a performance. I'm using my body, my mind, my emotional life, using the tools to open my imagination. All right, so here we go. This is Mrs. Potts. Full out expanded. Letting the tool take over, letting the tool lead. He walked through that door, and suddenly everything was different. He clombed through those tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. He talked in a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house, and it seemed good. Don't know that I'd ever do the monologue that way, but it was fun. All right, full out contracted. I'm going to stand for most of it so you can see my whole body, but I could be lying on the floor sitting. And again, this is full out. It might move from different parts of my body. It might be my whole body. I'm exploring. I'm also working to deal with mind, heart, guts, arms, hands, fingers, toes, jaw. Anything that I can remember to contract. He walked through the door, and everything suddenly was different. He clomped through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. He talked in a booming voice that shook the ceilings. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house, and it seemed good. Full out contracted, more or less full out. From contract to expand. He walked through the door, and suddenly everything was different. He clomped through the tiny rooms, like he was still in the great outdoors. He talked with a booming voice that shook the ceiling. reverse it, expand and contract. He walked through the door, and everything seemed different. He climbed through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. He talked in a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me that there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Veil them. Full body. And then maybe I'll do some close-ups. Totally expanded over. But veiled. He walked through the door. And everything seemed different. Clocked through the tiny rooms, like he was still in the great outdoors. Talked with a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Veiled contract. He walked through the door, and suddenly everything was different. He clocked through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. He talked with a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Contract to expand. He walked through the door and suddenly everything was different. He clogged through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. Spoke with a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Expand and contract. He walked through the door and suddenly everything was different. He walked through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. Talked with a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. It seemed good. Now what my work would be, at this point, would be to go back and consider those things and do some analytical work and work with the other actors, the director. But more than anything, to be open to ways my body could incorporate whatever choices, whatever imaginings, whatever inspirations, whatever intellectual choices I decide to make as the actor.
I'm going to do a few veiled versions of expansion and contraction. I'll do the same sequences that I did full out or on the full body shot, a long shot. I'll do expanded and contracted, contract to expand, expand to contract. And I simply wanted to work in close-up for those of you who might be interested in wondering what this is like, close-up, or for those of you who might be interested in doing film work. Right? So I'll probably talk between you, and hopefully the frame is okay. This is expanded. Okay. These are all veiled versions. He walked through the door and suddenly everything was different. He clomped through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. Spoke in a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Contracted all the way through, but veiled. He walked through the door and suddenly everything was different. He clomped through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. Talked in a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Contracted to expanded. He walked through that door and suddenly everything was different. He clomped through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. Talked in a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Expand and contract. He walked through the door and suddenly everything was different. He clomped through the tiny rooms like he was still in the great outdoors. He spoke in a booming voice that shook the ceiling. Everything he did reminded me there was a man in the house. And it seemed good. Now there are always going to be variations in this. It wavers between expansion and contraction, contraction and expansion. And that dynamic tension, that polarity, is one of the exciting discoveries you make.